Hello, I'm Iain Glen and I play John Manley in Black Beauty and also Ser Jorah Mormont in Game of Thrones. Today I'm very happy to be reading one of the finalist stories in the high school category for the Wild Beauty Foundation second annual creative writing contest with the theme of connection and wild horses. This is Jeolho and it's written by Noemie P from Singapore. She's 16 years old. It's a wonderful story. On the day when the sultry summer air made my clothes stick to my back, Appa came home hauling a horse in tow. She was strange and short, like the trunk of a tree carefully balanced across 4 crooked legs. Her brown coat had fur sticking in every direction where the wind had called and she had followed. Nevertheless, Appa couldn't stop singing his praises. "Isn't she beautiful, Barra? So strong and young, I could barely keep my grip on her reins." He patted the horse's lower back fondly, and in return received the first of 17 kicks that Jeolho, our new horse, would bestow to him by summer's end. For 6 whole days, Appa and I set to work on erecting a wooden fence with materials pilfered from the village's farm. We worked tirelessly under the summer sun, each night spending hours scrubbing the earth stains off our skin and cooling our swollen feet in buckets of fresh water. All the while, Jeolho stomped nearby, restless in the comfort of her shaded tree. When the time came to bring Jeolho into her new home, my father insisted on bathing and brushing her clean. She hated being scrubbed. She hated being tethered while we doused her with clean water. She liked it even less when Appa made her stand on 3 legs while we scraped the muck off the underside of her hooves, but she didn't mind being brushed. By the end, her hooves shone and she no longer scratched herself. We thought she was finally settling, Appa and I. "No, she's just like you, dear," Appa said to Oma. "You're only happy when you're clean." My mother smacked him with her dishcloth for that. We spent the rest of the evening nursing our ears from her lectures. But our efforts were wasted. Jeolho entered her new home where our sweat had watered the grass, a completely new horse compared to the one I had first met. My parents and I watched her take in her surroundings, a fizzle of hope tugging at the edge of our minds. I glimpsed the future. Jeolho and I riding together, Jeolho and I finding shade in the forest, eating lunch with her, brushing her, sneaking her treats. She started running, galloping at top speed to the edge of the field before skidding back to run in the opposite direction. 23 times she did this, hurling towards one end only to divert at the last minute and run in the opposite direction. We watched on, speechless. Gradually, Jeolho galloped slow to a trot, swiveling her head, looking for a way out. She let out a series of terrifying, frustrated neighs, stomping her hooves until her silky hair came into tangles, and her lovely coat, which I spent an afternoon brushing, was spattered with mud, oblivious to my shattering breaths. I couldn't leave. I could barely look at Jeolho. At that moment, I hated her. It was stupid, I know. She was just a horse. What could she know about human emotion? As if sensing my thoughts, Jeolho turned her head towards me. A moment passed, the stillness in the space between us suddenly so apparent. It was as if our very breaths had disappeared, and that she turned her head, munching at stray patches of grass. My father didn't relent. Each morning before the sun had a chance to cast its warmth over our land, I would spot him sneaking out the back door, barefoot over to Jeolho's fence. He disappeared through the gaps of the fence only to come hurtling out with Jeolho at his heels. And while Appa was buckled over, gasping for air, Jeolho would trot in laps, neighing triumphantly. It was always short-lasted, for her victories were still strung in chains and her momentary joy would never compare to a breath of freedom. "You must be patient, Jin. She will not bend straight away. If you push too hard, she'll only snap," my mother said, bathing Appa's back. It was one of those nights when the air tasted heavy with the promise of rain. I watched through the crack of the doorway. They were both turned away from me, my mother kneeling on the mattress, my father in front of her, slumped and bare, his skin wet and glowing in the light. There is no time, Appa sighed. They're bound to come in a month this time. We cannot refuse them. Bahram would never forgive you if you wrote out a future like this. Uma responded sharply. She'd hate you. Appa turned suddenly, looking straight into Omar's eyes. In the half-light, he looked twice his age. You think I don't know that? We don't have time. The farm hasn't given a good crop in months, and the matchmaker advised. Matchmaker? They both turned, gaping at me. Bahram, what are you still doing up? Omar rose over to me. What matchmaker? I asked, lip trembling. You were going to send me off with a stranger in exchange for a horse? Were you going to tell me on the day of my wedding? I was almost screaming. Hush, hush, dear, it was only an idea. I didn't listen to the rest of it. I ran out into the night where the clouds crashed angrily against each other, sending sparks of fury across the land. Within seconds, fat, heavy raindrops stung my face and splattered over my skin. I sprinted across the porch, thunder roaring in my ears, matching my fury, matching my rage. My tears fell with the rain. They'd been washed away by morning, lost in the ground. High-pitched whinnies broke through the night. In the bursts of lightning, Jeolho's figure came through. She was rearing on her back legs, terrified of the claps of thunder, slipping in the mud. I hate you, I told her. She whinnied in my face. Do you understand? I hate you. I couldn't stop screaming. She pulled her hairy lips back and neighed with all her might, no longer pacing. We filled the spaces of silence with our cries. In that moment, I felt something change. Perhaps a shift in the wind or a drop in temperature, but for a second, while we both caught our breaths, Jeolho and I understood each other. We felt each other's futility, the loss of control over our lives. Our choices had been grappled away from us by the same man, my father. I won't let him do it, I vowed. Jeolho snorted. What could I do? A fresh whip of lightning lashed through the sky, so close this time I could feel its heat and power go straight through me. Her whinnies were the last thing I heard. I awoke warm and dry in my bed. My window was open a crack, traces of my mother. There was nobody downstairs. I slipped my boots on and trotted across the smooshed grass, faintly aware that I was still in my pajamas. Jeolho was standing half asleep at the edge of the fence. Next to her was a huge scattered pile of hay, dumped each morning unceremoniously by my father, who'd long given up trying to befriend Jeolho. Hi, Jeolho, I said softly. Her ears twitched in my direction, but she didn't move. I hesitated before slowly slipping through the fence. She was looking my way now, her expression impassive. Cautiously, I rose my hand, offering her my knuckles. She closed the distance, nostrils flaring against my skin, before snorting heavily and turning away. I let out my breath, unaware that I'd held it in. Thank you, I whispered. By the time my parents came home, I had raked her straw into a neat pile, dumped her waste into the compost and brushed Jeolho's back free of mud. I refused to talk to my father. He understood and left me the space I needed. I began to spend hours with Jeolho. There were days when she was ill-tempered and flattened her ears, and there were quiet days where she snorted in my presence and listened to me talk. Gradually, she began to perk her ears up when she saw me, sniffing my pockets for chunks of stolen fruits and bread, staying still whilst I wrapped my arms around her neck and stroked her face. The day came when a sleek blue car rolled in front of our home. A man in his early 20s stepped out, followed by an older couple, hair graying at the roots, and another man wearing a suit. Omar ushered them inside, where she prepared a pot of tea and platters of sweetened cake and biscuits. You don't talk much. Is she simple? The woman asked snootily. No, our Bahram is very bright, Appa responded. I had been forced to wash that morning, although already clean from last night, and dressed in a skirt rather than my usual grass-stained jeans. Baram, as in wind, what made you choose such a name? She's so thin that I think she might snap at any moment. The husband laughed loudly. I didn't like them at all, and their son was even worse. He didn't speak, simply brooding moodily at his tea. I was very glad when they left. My father shut the door with a sigh, sharing a look with my mother before looking at me. The wedding will take place in 2 weeks. Jin, objected Oma. He is perfectly respectable, and Baram will be very comfortable in their care. No, I shouted. You will do as I say, my father bellowed back. The door slammed behind me, the hinges rattling as plaster from the ceiling rained down on my head. I could hear my parents calling my name. Baram, Baram! I found myself running towards Jeolho. She perked her ears up in my direction, sniffing curiously at my cheek. I wrapped my arms around her neck, sobbing into her comforting warmth. Without thinking about it, I clambered onto her back. She shuffled around, unused to my weight, neighing in protest before bolting across the field, my fingers wrapped tightly into her bristly mane as I held on for dear life. Jeolho! I gasped. She was heading straight for the fence. Jeolho! She snorted harder, galloping faster. I squeezed my eyes shut against the wind. She leapt into the air, my hair dropping into the pit of my stomach. And we were free. Jeolho neighed loudly, heading straight for the edge of the fields. I'd never seen her this excited. Ears forward, head held up high. Each galloper lunged towards freedom. My thighs ached from grasping so tightly, but I could not let go. All it took was one little slip and I'd fall to my death under Jeolho's hooves. I buried myself into her warm fur, hoping for her to stop soon. Suddenly I was jolted over her head. I flailed in midair for a second. A bubble of panic exploded in me and I screamed louder than I ever had. I fell in an unceremonious heap, hitting my head hard on the ground. Jeolho! I cried angrily, crawling up to my knees. But she wasn't looking at me. Her head was turned, facing the mass expanse of land in front of us. Far off, barely visible amongst the shadows of the shrubs and bushes, a herd of creatures grazed in the fields. A loud neigh echoed in our direction. Jeolho responded. She took a couple of steps and stopped. I was certain she'd turn round, neigh in my direction, or even just a tiny snort. Say goodbye to the girl whose family was trading her for a hand in marriage. Maybe even a glance would have been enough. She did nothing of the sort. Instead, walked forward without looking back, breaking into a gallop towards freedom. I didn't expect it to hurt so much. No, I really didn't.